Mr. KO.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I love that we got the memo on the mics there, so we could get them right in the shot perfectly.
Indeed. Yes, we're definitely upgrading. Continuous improvement.
Continuous improvement. I love it. I love it. Well, welcome everybody to Intersections. It is wonderful to have you here. We are so very fortunate every single week to have some of the most amazing minds, some of the most amazing artists join us. And also, very lucky to have you here with us, supporting us each and every week. As you log on, please do share where you're tuning in from. We want to see where we're reaching all around the world, build this big community into a much smaller, much more collaborative world. And also, if you have any questions for our guests, please submit them in real time, and we will make sure that you are on screen with those questions. Also, if you're watching this after it's aired live, you can reach out to John and myself at any time, and we will respond. We're building a community here. We are essentially, John and I had a great conversation last night about some of our exciting new recruits who are going to help us bring to life some of the things we've been promising for, I don't know, John, what do you think, 6 months now?
Well, since the very beginning, I think, and we've been an army of two, and now we're talking about expanding our capacity so we can get some of the fancier stuff done.
Yeah, the fancier stuff. Exactly. Well, with that said, I'll do a formal introduction and then we'll kick in because I see our first guest is backstage in the green room. Welcome to Intersections, the weekly conversational jam session that dives deep into intersections among technology, innovation, culture, ideas, artistry. We bring diverse personalities and worldviews together in the service of greater understanding and unlearning. My co-host and friend, John Kao, was called Mr. Creativity by The Economist. He is always blowing my mind with who he's advising or speaking to. One of these days, John, I'm going to have to ask for some introductions because your network is mind-blowing. He has taught at Harvard Business School. He served as visiting faculty at the MIT Media Lab in Stanford. He is a Tony-nominated producer of film and stage and wrote the best-selling Jamming: The Art and Discipline of Business Creativity. When I got the chance to visit him live and stay in his wonderful home in San Francisco, I got to see also some of the textbooks he's written and all kinds of crazy things. It's just wonderful and also a privilege to be your co-host. John, welcome to Intersections.
Hey, Brian. So thanks for mentioning the Hacienda in San Francisco. This is now also our studio because as we speak, AV people are miking the place up with shotgun mics, and sandbags are holding up microphone posts, and video and lighting, and all of these things are being implemented. So we hope to actually expand the kind of media aperture and include not just two-on-one interviews, but salon sessions and live events of all kinds. So stay tuned, please, because it's going to be very exciting. I want to acknowledge that Brian is an equally adept practitioner of mind-blowing. And the fact that he references my network is flattering because he has an unusually large and diverse network of his own. And if we map the two of us, I think we've got the topic of innovation Pareto optimal, at least in terms of coverage. Brian is a thought leader. He's been involved with digital since before digital was a thing. And so digital and social marketing, digital and innovation, digital and organizational transformation. He's a thought leader, domain expert, consultant, advisor, keynote speaker, author, and even has, believe it or not, a day job, which is a global chief evangelist for innovation at Salesforce.
Well,
so here we
John, look at that. Thank you. And let's jump right in. I'm excited to have a friend of mine on here, and he is. It's been fun to watch him just blow up. He's always been an influential voice in the world of technology, specifically in innovative technology and disruptive technology. But now he's a published author. He has an incredible newsletter. He's on TV all the time. Welcome, Alex Kantrowitz. I don't even know where to start, but how about if I just set the stage real quick and then kind of brief us on what you're working on. But you wrote a great book called Always Day One. Let me see if I could bring that up here. Nope, wrong one, wrong button. Here we go. Always Day One, how the tech titans plan to stay on top forever. And I feel like when you recite the title of your book, you have to raise your pinky to your bottom lip like Dr. Evil. Alex, Alex, welcome to Intersections. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. It's great to be here. And note, by the way, the subtitle is how they plan to stay on top forever, not how they will stay on top forever. And that's the idea.
That's true. That must have been a Freudian slip.
Release it to people and give them an opportunity to co-op what the tech giants do well. And then hopefully it won't be just 5 companies at the top of the economy and everybody else looking up.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Also, I failed to mention, but we should get this up there. And Gregarious, if you're listening, maybe you can pop up the Big Technology Substack URL on screen. But you have also an uber popular newsletter that continues this conversation past the book. So, Alex, I mean, give us the inspiration behind the book and the newsletter, and what are you working on?
Yeah, so I'll start with the book. Let's say in 2017, I met with Mark Zuckerberg, first time, talk about a new project that Facebook was working on. And the CEO briefing was very different from almost any other one I had done before. You know, typically as a reporter, we go in, the CEO gives us about, a 25-minute lecture. A PR person looks on, and if we're, nodding our head and engaged, then maybe they let us ask a question. And if not, they say, well, thanks for coming. Have a great one. Looking forward to your story. With Zuckerberg, it was very different. It was all about, here's what we're doing. Can you give us feedback? And I was like, oh, this is like a really strange sales tactic. Why is he asking for feedback? But as I poked around a little bit more, I found out that, feedback delivered throughout Facebook is something that's been core to the company. So there are posters on the wall that say feedback is a gift. Every major meeting ends with a request for it. And, people are empowered to go up to Zuckerberg and tell them that he's thinking about something, completely wrong. And Facebook should do it an opposite way. And at times that saved the company. And I think that like our feeling around feedback is like, well, we should just let people know where they are before the review so they're not surprised. But I think that's so small-minded. And what I really found inside Facebook is that it's about, making sure that ideas can travel from division to division, from down on the hierarchy to the top, and not keeping them sort of captured in the corporate muck where they often go to die. And, I call the book Always Day One because these companies just reinvent themselves over and over and over again. And only by appreciating ideas from throughout the company are you able to do that. And so for each company, I go through and talk about like how their work culture and how their leadership is different from most companies that I've seen elsewhere and why that's allowed them to thrive. Because 100 years ago, the average company lasted on the S&P 500 for 67 years. Now it's 15 years. So you could basically live your whole existence off of one idea back then. Now you need about 3.5. And so how do companies survive? They reinvent over and over and over again. And that's why I think the tech giants are bucking this trend while everybody else is kind of looking around and going like, hey, what happened? Why are they able to do that?
That's a very eloquent way of positioning everything here, because I think, I've been what's the best way to put this? Maybe a tech optimist is probably the way I'll put it. Having been in Silicon Valley since the 90s and watching this constant evolution and revolution and reinvention, these cycles happen over and over and over again. And you think back to like the late 90s and the early 2000s with the dot-com rush and then the dot bomb. And you have this sort of different mindset from the outside in that'll look at that and say, oh, I remember those times. Those are, where are those companies now? And like the instinctual sort of nature to look at the failures of a lot of these incredible transformations in Silicon Valley, when in fact what they have given way is to constant improvement, iteration and innovation, feedback. Those feedback loops have led to this ideation and constant reinvention, constant innovation, constant branching off. And so what do you think it is that you learned as you were writing Always Day One that other decision makers, and let's just say more legacy based organizations, miss when they come to Silicon Valley on those buses and take the tours all around our favorite companies?
Well, it's not about the slides, and it's not about the volleyball courts, and it's not about free lunch. People think that that's the secret to the culture inside these companies, and it really isn't. And one thing that I found is that the tech giants, Amazon out in front, have reimagined the way that work is structured and the way that the processes inside their companies work, the way that they use technology in order to be able to thrive. And I'll just explain it that in this way. We've gone through three major transformations in the history of work in the past 100 years. 100 years ago, we were really in the industrial economy still. And they're basically, you didn't really ask employees for ideas because what were we going to do? You were in a factory making widgets. An employee came over to you and said, "I want to make hammers." You would laugh them right out of the factory. Then we moved to the knowledge economy in the 70s, where we all of a sudden wanted employee ideas. But here's the thing. While we say we want employee ideas, we still have, work that looked a lot like the factory, right? Because, in the factory, people were turning widgets and not doing anything involved in the creation of, turning dials and not involved in anything in the creation of new things. Well, in the knowledge economy, we have most people that are not involved in the creation of new things also, right? They move data from spreadsheet to spreadsheet. They, continue to operationalize the stuff that has been operationalized forever. And then you only have like a group of people at the top that are making the decisions in terms of what are we going to do next. And they might say they're interested in feedback, but they're not really interested in feedback. They're interested in people falling in line and doing what their job is, doing what they were hired for. Job description, right? One sheet, that's what you do. That's it. I think the tech giants have really reimagined work where they flipped it, right? Where instead of doing all this execution and support work, what they really want their employees to do is come up with new ideas and bring them to life. And I think this is the way they do that is pretty special because they use technology to help minimize that amount of support work that people do. They automate, they use machine learning, and then they don't fire, right? That's key. A lot of people are like, you automate, then you fire. I think that's totally wrong. What they do is they automate and they make room for idea work. And then people work on new ideas. And that's how they end up reinventing. So I think if you were just going to look at the volleyball court and the free lunch, you would miss that. And I think the secret sauce is actually what goes on, day to day and how they've been able to really perfect these systems and get people working on new things as opposed to just like, all right, well, we're this type of company. And so we're going to continue to support this type of product without like thinking about what the future might hold. Because if there's anything that we've learned, Brian, you've seen it, firsthand out here, right? Is that the second you think that you're ahead of the market, you're behind. I like there's this saying that J.J. Watt, who's a football player, says the moment you think you've made it is the moment you begin your decline. And that might be true in the NFL, but it's true in business as well. And, if we're not looking around the corner, we're in some deep trouble.
Oh yeah. Well, who was it? Was it Andy Grove who said only the paranoid survive?
Only the paranoid survive. Yeah.
And I think there's paranoid and there's also hunger and there's vision and there's drive and what we see in Silicon Valley and what I think we all could appreciate around the world is sort of this idea of creativity, especially in this new relationship, this new era between man and machine with AI and automation and employees and this great need to upskill existing talent and then also groom the next generation of talent. Curious where you have seen, and John, I'll throw it to you after this because I'll make sure that it's mutual interaction here. Where have you seen some of the more, let's just say, traditional mindsets, traditional organizations excel in what you've observed in some of the greatest companies in Silicon Valley? Or have you seen that they've done things different?
Yeah, the Amazon retail organization to me is like my favorite example here. So for a long time, the Amazon's first party retail was the core of its business, right? The people that were buying products from companies and stocking them in the fulfillment centers before they would end up being sent out to you. These people are called vendor managers. They'd be on the phone with Tide, for instance, and be like, all right, we need this many units of detergent in these fulfillment centers in these zip codes at this time at this price. And that's how when you hit, buy, it gets to you in a day or two. It's because they anticipate. And what Amazon realized was it had 20 years worth of historic data, and it could much easily turn that over to the machines and basically say, all right, machine learning, you make the predictions, and then we'll see what the order volume is, at what price, and what our margins are. And then because you do self-learning, you can adjust and end up making better purchase decisions. So today, actually inside Amazon, it's all done through machines. It used to be done through vendor managers. Now, people who want to supply inside Amazon fulfillment centers will get their order from a machine. They will negotiate with an internet portal that has machine learning on the back end, right? And then they go and submit, and then the machine says, oh, okay, we did well, or we missed our demand. Now we're going to do for the next quarter, we'll do this, right? And now you have to, it's hard to appreciate how big of a change this was. Amazon was the everything store. What are the people that were making the everything store run got automated? Okay, so what happens then? And this is really where the magic is, because instead of firing them, Amazon did something really smart. They said, we're going to make you project managers and program managers. We know there's a lot more work to be done in the retail space. Why don't you go find out what's coming next and build it? And I'll just tell one story to bring it home. There's a guy named Dilip Kumar inside Amazon. He was the head of pricing and promotions inside the company. How much the products cost? When do we want to promote them on the website? Obviously, that stuff is red meat for machine learning algorithms. Hand it over to the machines. They'll do a much better job, figuring out what to feature and how much we should sell it for, because they can process far more data than any human can and learn and predict much better than we can. So, he goes and shadows Jeff Bezos for a year as his technical advisor, just taking every meeting, just learning how the company works. By the time he's done, there was not much of a future in pricing and promotions, right? Machines do a good job at that. So he said, okay, we'll try something else. He doesn't leave the company, right? I might have left the company. I might have been like, what, you gave my stuff over to machine learning? I'm not needed here anymore. I'm out. But he said, no, why don't we try to tackle a new problem? So he said, let's try to use technology to solve the most annoying part of shopping in real life. And so they're like, okay, well, what is this? Well, it turns out people really like to go in store and they browse and they pick stuff off shelves. That's actually quite pleasurable. The most annoying part of shopping in real life is checking out. People don't like waiting online and having someone go through all their stuff and then, getting out, 20 minutes after they really should have. So they say, okay, let's build a big vending machine, right? And people punch their orders in and some tubes will suck the products out and then distribute them to you. And then they brought it to Bezos. Didn't quite work. It felt like kicking the can down the curb. So I said, okay, let's try to use some more technology. And they said, what if we use sensors and machine learning so that someone can scan into a store? We monitor them as they go about picking things off shelves, track the items to the person, and then just let them walk out. No scanning, no checkout. And that ended up becoming Amazon Go, which is going to be the foundation of Amazon's brick and mortar effort in the years ahead. I mean, you read Amazon's annual statement, and it's very clear they're firmly believing that Go is going to be the future of their brick and mortar retail. They might do it on their own. They'll more likely license out to other stores. And now you have that Amazon layer in front of all brick and mortar retail, just the same way that it's on the internet. So this is the magic here, right? And a department that could be old and stodgy and stuck in its ways gets automated. And then instead of firing the workers, Amazon keeps them. And instead of getting mad, the workers say, let's do something constructive. And they build the next evolution of the Amazon business. And I think everyone can learn from this. And it's not just a tech giant thing. It's hard, but there's a lesson there for everyone. And I felt that it was an important story to tell.
That is one of the best stories to tell in that, as you said, it's the foundation for the future of brick and mortar retail in general. And that's just the beginning of some of the things that they're experimenting with. And John, as I turn it over to you, one of the things that I want to highlight for those who are watching that aren't in the startup space or in the technology space, you work in a company, regardless of the industry it's in, that has to become a technology company in these times. And you also have to create a culture of creativity, of entrepreneurialism inside and of innovation, because what you can take away from that story was, here's someone who would probably lose their job in any given company as a result of that switch to machine learning, but instead, given the opportunity and the space and the time and the support, created essentially the future of retail. And I'm sure he's just getting started on some of the other things. And imagine if you empowered this at scale. So I'll get off the preaching box here and turn it over to you, John.
Well, I'd like to continue this topic of creativity in the tech giants. It's very interesting to me for a variety of reasons, and I'm curious because my understanding of Amazon, for example, is that it's an incredibly disciplined company. There are incredibly disciplined processes. Jeff Bezos famously required people to write detailed memos and circulate them and read them at meetings in advance of opening their mouths to actually have discussions, which required obviously a great deal of preparation and thought and so forth and so on. And if you look at a company like Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg is essentially the jury on what gets advanced and what doesn't, there creativity may flourish, but there's also a kind of a Darwinian pathway and struggle for ideas to actually survive and get to the surface. So how do we reconcile this notion of these intensely disciplined and also judgmental elements of the process with the creativity? And is the kind of romantic notion is that we're going to have a culture of creativity that basically encourages everyone to come forward with their ideas. But these are big, complex organizations, and not everybody is in the creativity aristocracy to be able to sit in a boardroom with Jeff Bezos or his successor now and kind of voice their ideas.
Yeah, so I would say not everyone is going to end up there, but I think these companies have created ways to get as many ideas, as many good ideas as possible to leadership. And so I'll start with the 6-pager. The 6-pager is and when you want to create a new product or start a new project inside Amazon, you write it down in one of those documents that you mentioned, a 6-pager. It's 6 pages. It says everything about the way it's going to be. Oftentimes it includes fake press releases from with quotes from fake customers talking about how great the product is and why it makes sense for their business. And I spoke with an ex-Amazon employee about this, and he told me that it was like writing science fiction, right? Because when you do this, you write everything that's going to happen with the project, and writing encourages you to think and close gaps in your thinking and really contemplate what's actually going to happen. So it is an extremely creative process. Now, the cool thing about the written word is it can get to leadership, pretty quickly, instead of having to sit down and, have imagine if you had every employee. Yeah, exactly, John. And every employee, standing up and pitching, and, we tend to ramble, right? But when we write, it's succinct and it includes everything, right? So an executive that's just coming in on a project can catch up in extremely quick fashion, right? Facebook, of course, Mark Zuckerberg is going to make all the decisions, right? But he's created these mechanisms to get ideas to him quickly. That's what the feedback culture is all about, right? If you have an idea, you're encouraged to go bring it up to him, whether that's in his Q&A with employees or even walking up to him on the side. Like, that's not weird inside Facebook, right? Most people think, if you're in a company of like 10, 20, 30,000 people, you just don't walk up to the CEO and say, I think we should do this in orientation inside Facebook. People are encouraged to do that. And often they do. And I think this is sort of, you talk about the idea having aristocracy, right? And I think that the key is there's a tension between how much can a company actually do and how can you incentivize people to have ideas? Because ultimately there's going to be a delta between the amount of stuff you're able to build and the amount of ideas you have. And there has to be some selection there. So I think what these systems at the tech giants do is they minimize first of all, they empower employees to come up with these ideas, and they minimize the amount of time and red tape it takes to get those ideas to judgment. Ultimately, we're never going to use technology to solve for judgment. Judgment's always going to be human, but we can take technology and we can create processes to cut through all the red tape and the barriers that would get in the way of getting that idea to judgment as soon as possible. And that's what the 6-pager is inside Amazon. That's their way of doing it. And that's what the feedback culture is inside Facebook. That's their way of doing it.
Really interesting. And you would imagine that there are lessons to be learned by other complex organizations as to, what this kind of set of key success factors is. So we just have a couple
Yeah.
of minutes. I wanted to kind of switch level of magnification. So, in the recent economic history of the last 150 years, we've had analogous, I won't call them monopolies, but definitely huge franchises. We had the railroads, we had the oil industry. And the reason that those franchises faded is partly because there were competitive technologies that were highly disruptive. For instance, railways. Then you had cars and you had airplanes. And with oil, there are tremendous issues in the sense that with Apple, you get locked into the Apple universe, but you don't get locked into Standard Oil's oil because oil is oil. It's kind of a commodity. So, what's different about the tech giants in terms of the potential for having sustainable franchises, or even we can call them monopolies, that are going to exist indefinitely? That 500 years from now, there will still be an Apple computer company in whatever form it is, because, first of all, digital allows for lock-in. And secondly, everything is going to be digital, right? It's not like something is going to replace digital, like oil is being replaced by offshore wind or something like that. So what does your science fiction sense say about that sustainability issue?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because, every time we think that these companies will never get moved, there's always something that comes up and hits them where they're not expecting. I've covered, the company I've covered the most out of all these has been Facebook. And it's just stuck out to me that Facebook is the most vulnerable of all because it doesn't have an operating system. Like Apple has iOS, Google has Android, Amazon has that voice that lives inside the Echo. And if I say it, it will set it off. But you know who she is. Microsoft has Windows and Azure, right? What does Facebook have? I mean, it's dying for an operating system. That's why all you hear from Mark Zuckerberg these days is how Oculus is the future, because Facebook owns the operating system and it really wants VR to happen. So it's not at the mercy of Apple and Google anymore. Meanwhile, you see competitors nipping at its toes, right? This is probably the most challenged Facebook's been in the past decade when you think about TikTok and Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces, which are now starting to take a lot of the energy that once was on places like the Facebook newsfeed and Instagram. But what gives them the chance to persist? What's their plan to stay on top forever? And again, I think it comes back to reinvention. People think about always day one, which is what Bezos says, right? Even the Times had this article that got it completely wrong, right? Which is like, day one means work your ass off and don't let up. And, the second you're not working through Thanksgiving, you're in day two. And by the way, a lot of Amazon employees do work through Thanksgiving and Black Friday. But I don't think that's the key to success, right? The best thing about being a startup is you come in on your first day, on day one, and you don't have to worry about any legacy products. You don't have to worry about, most companies, once they've been around for a while, they say, we have to do these 10 things in order to support the product that got us here. And then we can start thinking about new things. A startup on its first day can say, what is the best product we can build for the market, and how soon can we build it, and dedicate 100% of its energy towards that. Now, an established company will never, be able to dedicate 100%. But the key is, can you dedicate as much of your energy as possible towards reinventing and building new things? And that's where the technology and the process inside these companies, where they minimize support work, make room for idea work, and encourage their employees to bring ideas to leadership, and then eventually empower them to go out and build it and reinvent, which is their secret. And that's why a company like Amazon has gone from a first-party retail organization to one that does third-party retail through marketplace, logistics, and fulfillment, cloud computing. It's also a voice computing operating system, a hardware manufacturer with stuff like the Kindle, an Academy Award-winning movie studio, a grocer, and now it's getting into healthcare, right? That is how these companies persist. It's not by being really good at one idea. It's anticipating where the future is going to be by listening to their employee ideas and then going hard towards the next opportunity.
Well, I'm about to go on Amazon and buy your book.
I appreciate that.
Very interesting. I'm sure there is a lot more that can be said about all of this, but thank you very much. Brian, back to you.
Yeah, Alex, if you could give me maybe one more minute, and I see Curtis is backstage. Curtis, we will be coming to you here shortly. you wrote something in December that I've been wanting to ask you about. Let me pop it up
Oh
here.
boy, I'm in
Which-
trouble now. Oh, we're talking about Miami. Okay, here we go.
We had
Yeah.
Mark, founder of Kite, on a few weeks back, and we were talking about this buzz that the media narrative around Miami and Austin, and your research blew my mind in terms of where that real growth was coming, and then also kind of like popping the bubble that Silicon Valley is here to stay. And would love to just hear your thoughts in closing as to where are we and what's this post-pandemic world going to look like for technology.
Yeah, I think that the media, I'm a member of the media, so I'll cop to it. The media loves narratives, right? We love to see like 3 people moving to Miami. They say 3 is a trend story, 2 is whatever. The editor says, okay, bring me a third. So you find 3 executives that move to Miami, and then they're like, all right, green light, the future of tech is in Miami. And by the way, like I've had Miami Mayor Francis Suarez on my podcast. I think he's great. I think he's a terrific mayor for Miami, and is doing a great job in terms of economic development there. But just because he is doesn't mean that Miami is now the future of tech. And actually, I looked at, so in the story that you just pulled up, I looked at the data that LinkedIn had in terms of where tech workers were moving to, and found that tech worker migration to Miami, hasn't increased dramatically. In fact, it increased basically within the margin of error, over the pandemic. Tech worker migration to Austin actually slowed down. Tech workers moved to Austin at a slower rate during the pandemic than they did previously. People are going to, Midwest cities like Madison, Wisconsin, which has experienced a migration boom during the pandemic, and then for places like Sacramento, California. Basically, what we've traditionally thought of as B-tier cities that sit outside, major hubs like San Francisco. People have left, maybe realizing they could Zoom, still liking Northern California, wanting affordable cost of living, and they've gone there. And in fact, a lot of the suburbs around San Francisco has seen overall the migration, as opposed to like people en masse taking their talents to South Beach. So I think it's always nice to look at the data, and then look at, like, put it next to the narrative and see what the truth is. And in this case, Miami, I'm sure, has a much buzzier tech scene now than it did before the pandemic, but it certainly doesn't seem like the future of the tech industry to me by any means. Although I think it's probably good that some of this stuff is more dispersed geographically. If you have tech folks making stuff in Madison, Wisconsin, or in Sacramento, I think they're going to start to build products while they're operating outside of the bubble of Silicon Valley, where like a lot of the folks here who start tech companies go to Stanford and they solve problems for Palo Alto. And I think that, if there are folks that are solving problems for people outside of, San Francisco Bay Area, that's probably good. But ultimately, Brian, you asked, like, what does it look like after, things come back? We have a tendency in the middle of a trauma, in the middle of a crisis, to say nothing will ever be the same. I think things largely return to, where they were. And, maybe companies will say you can come in, 2 to 3 days a week, as opposed to you have to come in 5 days a week. But if you're coming in 2 to 3 days a week, you still need to be in a city close to headquarters. And so that's where I think things net out.
Yeah. Well said, Alex. Well said. Well, what a pleasure it was to have you. And hopefully this isn't your only time joining us on Intersections. Everybody pick up Always Day One, his book, and subscribe to Big Technology on Substack. Alex, we will see you soon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Always great to chat, Brian, and nice to meet you, John.
It's great to meet you.
Yeah. Hopefully we do this again soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah, rock and roll, man.
All right. Take care.
See you soon. Woo! Wow. All right, John, that was
right.
exciting. I actually made some notes because I'm giving a presentation on this very subject that he hit in terms of what you can learn from the Amazons of the world and bring into legacy organizations that, and the biggest trap being, at some point you have to have a receiving mechanism and also a judgment infrastructure for that good idea, and also for the pursuit of those ideas. And I think that's probably one of the hardest challenges legacy organizations have, because they're just not designed for that. And every time you see you hear about those amazing CEOs or amazing leaders who are able to transform these legacy organizations because they're unique in that regard, that they're able to sort of be much more open-minded than that sort of traditional mindset, and they're usually incredibly charismatic as well.
It's the classic pendulum swing between divergence and convergence. I mean, you want to let 100 flowers bloom, but then you want to have the mechanisms not only for making smart judgments, but also for doing highly effective implementation. And that's, the kind of bicameral nature of creativity in an organization is you have to have skills that are often in conflict with one another, but which are applied at the appropriate time. So process matters. Process matters.
Yeah, process matters.
So with that, let's turn our attention to our second guest, Curtis Hougland. And just before I do that, let me just call out the fact I've been looking at the chat, as I'm sure many of you have, and we have an unusually international group of viewers today. I mean, maybe not so unusual, but I've just been noticing we have people from India and Greece and Iraq and Croatia and Venezuela and Brazil and you name it. It seems like we've got people listening in from Toronto, and as far back as the chat will let me go to peek at it. So thank you very much. And these are obviously global issues, and while Brian and I may be products of certain innovation hotspots like the San Francisco Bay Area, we certainly see ourselves as being responsible to a global audience. So Curtis Hougland has been around the digital agenda for a long time. As far as I can parse his storied career, it goes as far back as the beginning of the 1990s, so at least 3 decades. Beginning as a creative director, moving into digital marketing agency work, but then laddering up to the point where he's now the founder and CEO of Main Street One and People First Marketing, which are very interesting companies that we'd all like to understand a little bit more about.
Sure.
Described as peer-to-peer management of peer-to-peer campaigns using first-party data. So that, just unpacking that sentence will be a big deal. But the notion of influencing opinion at the molecular level for social good seems to be one of the themes. And in fact, engagement in social causes, generally speaking, seems to be a prime motivation. Curtis is also involved with a number of activities that have to do with social good. For example, New York Cares, which is a philanthropy based in the New York City area. So Curtis, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
At least limited justice to your really interesting career.
Yeah. Curtis, before we even let you say anything, I got to say that the minute I heard Curtis explain this company, he's got to come on to Intersections. This was just too amazing. So please, Curtis, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And if I do this occasionally in the interview, it means in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So we've made some forays. I think that there's a lot more that we haven't figured out than we have.
Well, you're being very humble, but it would be good, I think, for us all to get like the elevator story about what Main Street One is all about and what this whole notion of peer-to-peer campaigns is all about.
Yeah, I think what's undergirding, almost everything we do as product developers and marketers has been the collapse in trust in Western societies. If you look at the confidence we have in, let's say, ads, it's down to 14%, right? We increasingly distrust the media. 80% of us don't trust corporations. Don't ask me about our trust in government because I think you know the answer to this. So you start to understand if there is this collapse in trust, who do we trust? Who would a consumer believe and listen to? And increasingly the answer is each other. And in this era of identity politics, increasingly each other means someone who shares our affinity, let's say politics, who shares an ethnicity, a geography that is considered from my in-group. So what we figured out how to do is 2 very, very simple things, is to set up an intelligence apparatus that allows us to identify messages that different communities already trust. What's already resident in the discourse, so by the time I communicate it to you, it's going to seem familiar. And secondarily, if they don't trust corporations and they don't trust institutions, can I change the messenger? And can I create thousands and thousands of pieces of peer-to-peer content from individuals who match the audience compositions we're trying to reach? So that could be really, really micro, Native Americans in Montana, right? It could be Black Republicans, right? It could be employees of Sephora. It could get really, really micro. So how can we thread the needle between what organically exists from the bottom up among the people and then deliver it to you through someone you are most likely to trust? And then to apply that not only in the commercial space, but more broadly to our origins in extremism, suicide prevention, and lots of really, really interesting categories we think. Let me pause there and say, does that make any sense at all, John?
Well, it made a lot of sense. But the thing that I didn't quite understand is how you overcome confirmation bias. Because if I'm interacting with people I trust, chances are there are people I feel comfortable with and where I feel like our belief systems are aligned. And so I would,
which is also part of the problem, right, John?
Sorry?
Which is also part of the challenge.
Right, exactly. So, I would expect someone I'm close to and trust to provide me with input that I feel relatively comfortable with, because it's in our kind of bubble of common understandings. But it seems like the agenda at Main Street One is to influence opinion towards some notion of virtue or the truth or accuracy or, better judgment. And I'm wondering how you ladder up to that from the confirmation bias phenomenon of being with people who you trust.
Well, I would say that, what we learned going back to 2013 and growing up countering, let's say, ISIS recruitment, is you can't displace an ideology without replacing it. And therefore, it already has to exist within your psyche and your belief system. So I don't know that we would sort of classify what we do as sort of trying to change facts and truths, but rather tap into emotionality that already exists within a group and to sort of say, can we bring that out of you? So, John, you might believe in gun safety. You might not be passionate about gun safety. And therefore, you as a messenger to the technology community, based on our modeling, you might thread the needle of being a credible messenger. But we can also answer the question. We were actually born out of of DARPA, where I would say our technology was, which is the research and development over the Pentagon. And really what the purpose of that technology was to do, which was to really answer the question that you just asked, is what is the difference between popularity and persuasion, right? How do we understand what grabs attention versus what will actually change someone's intention? I don't want to get too deep into the woods about that. But that's essentially what we're trying to do, is not make the obvious decision to say that I'm going to talk to you just because you're from Silicon Valley. So I think that the most trusted messenger will be someone else from Silicon Valley who's in technology, but to look at a broad range of your affinities, ethnicities, as well as your geographies to make informed decisions about who the messengers, the right messengers might be. And you can understand the import of that in presidential politics, in suicide prevention, in lots of interesting spaces.
So as if I'm hearing you correctly, this is not so much about trying to change people's opinions as it is about amplification of latent tendencies.
I think yeah. Sorry about that.
Well, that's the question. Is it, in other words, not bringing a novel set of ideas that cause me to make a, 90 or 50-degree turn, but more that, I might be interested in gun safety, but someone's going to bring to my attention a full-throated set of facts about it and will influence me to actually do something about it or change my perception or behavior about the magnitude of the problem in a way that has some constructive intent.
I think we could argue that it would go either way, and I'll cite some of the work we did for the Biden-Harris campaign. or some of the work that we did in politics. I think Brian was kind enough to show an early Vanity Fair piece that ran on some of this work. So in one case, let's say we're working with a group like Stacey Abrams Verified Action. And we know that Georgia is going to be won and lost largely on the turnout of Black Georgians, especially in a set of counties around Atlanta. So therefore, we're trying to amplify a behavior. So honoring the legacy of John Lewis, talking about fairness, and listening to like what that audience, to bring it out of them, to make them share with the communities why it's so important to vote. At the same time, what we're doing is talking to Trump voters. We ran a very successful campaign where what we were doing is identifying when Trump traveled to do his speeches. We would find groups of independents and Republicans that were frustrated that he was bringing COVID to their community. Therefore, they would create peer-to-peer content. We run that as ads and then measure whether we're able to persuade someone to be slightly more negative in their attitudes towards Donald Trump, right? Mm-hmm. So I would sort of argue that it really depends on the objective. Persuasion is sort of persuasion. And the ability is, like I said, to both extract virality and popularity from persuasion, but also figure out who John, who Brian, who large different populations are most likely to trust.
Sure. I wish somebody would hire you to work on the vaccination issue.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. They have.
Oh, really?
So the good people of Oregon, the good people of Maine, we do work with the Ad Council and others, deploying an army of thousands representing the most at-risk populations based on the data to raise their hand based on briefs and intelligence that we give them, but ultimately to contextualize and personalize it in a way that makes sense for their particular audiences. So right now, for example, given the micro nature of our work, is we're sourcing hundreds and hundreds of pieces of content from frontline and hospital workers, doctors, nurses, and essential workers, as well as faith and community labor leaders within Black and Hispanic communities. In places like Maine and Oregon, we're also paying a lot of concentration to what we call rugged libertarians, which is sort of a proxy for Trump voters, but different, who are proving the most resistant to sort of say, can you get members of their communities to speak up? And these aren't people that, by the way, are capital I influencers. They're everyday sort of folks, like me and my team that have just decided to raise their hand and say, hey, I care about this right now.
How well do you think this will work in other social environments and other cultures other than the US?
Well, our origin story was, doing two things, which was countering ISIL recruitment. And that was anywhere from Indonesia to North Africa to Europe. Not a lot in America, and I can get into the reasons for that. And then we were working for the US government to counter Russian digital interference in Western democracies. So our origin story is actually a global one. And even with the vaccine work, we're getting set to do some work in places like Ukraine, which are absolutely fascinating. So while the model is extensible, obviously there's a lot of nuance to language and understanding culture. So we will almost always need a local partner or partners to do the work. We've also done election work in places like Israel and other places, which is really exciting.
Well, I can imagine that the issues of trust and influence and peer-to-peer communication are going to, of necessity, have a cultural flavor to them. But whether it affects your basic model or not, I think is an interesting question to ponder. So, mindful of the time, I want to make sure that Brian gets in here because what you've done is really fascinating. And I'm sure Brian has a yard-long list of questions.
Yeah, and Brian, before you jump in, I will say that you have been somewhat inspirational in our work by introducing fast advertising into the commercial lexicon. Given our origins, we've done a version of it in sort of non-commercial spaces for a while, and so I was really excited to read some of your thought leadership there.
Thanks, Curtis. that's very that's very cool to hear. For those who don't know what Curtis is referring to, I wrote a piece in December, I think 2019, that followed Ryan Reynolds and Aviation Gin and their response to Peloton and the chaos that was happening in real time, and how they were able to essentially create a commercial following another commercial in a week's time. And the response uh, ended up becoming super popular. It took over the narrative for that season. It also led to an acquisition by Diageo, and it was just incredibly influential. And so that's the angle I took from it, was using the concepts of this fast advertising way of plugging into the cultural conversation of something rather than trying to market at, so that you could be much more influential from a peer-to-peer standpoint. So Curtis, thank you for that. Ironically, the work that I was doing in 2015, I wish I could have talked about at the time, which was essentially tracking disinformation and its effectiveness and its ability to create essentially the equivalent of an interest graph, or we could call it a confirmation bias graph, if you will. But the danger of what ISIL was doing, and how easy it was to radicalize people without their knowing. In fact, in many cases, if you look in politics today, some of the deepest conspiracy theorists actually feel like they're applying critical thinking to a lot of this, which is, I think, the scariest part of all. But what I wanted to ask you, well, actually, first, Curtis, thank you for what you do. I've been hoping that we could find some solution, and that the right people can find more solutions like you, so that we can take control, get a grip on this, because it is not scalable in a healthy way for our society, and it's getting worse. None of this plays out well, and so there's that old saying that the NRA likes to use, which is the if you want to fight a bad guy with a gun, you have to give the good guy a gun. And so there is a sense of this as like fighting fire with fire. So what I'd love to hear from you is what you're learning from these experiences, and where you draw the line in terms of ethics.
Sure.
And then I'm going to leave you with one last one, because I'm sure this is the only thing I'll be able to squeeze in, which is where do we go from here?
So I think what we're learning may seem obvious to both of you, which is it's not facts and truths that win the day, right? It is personal, emotional, and visual narratives that are really dominating the discussion. And in some ways, disinformation is a red herring, because once it all goes onto the internet, it's not fake or real. It's not human or machine. It's foreign or domestic. It's either persuasive discourse or it isn't. Either it's having an impact or it's different. So, we are in some ways, if you look at what the Internet Research Agency and others did, they're creating rapid response systems to where they detect opportunities and risks emerging in the discourse, and then they program against it through content. You asked about the line, and I think the line is really clear, which is you need total radical transparency, right? So every piece of communication we make is public in terms of our communication with the network. It is all disclaimed and disclosed. It is all out there in the open, if you want to look into Ad Manager. So we don't use bots. We don't use automation in that way. What we believe is that the greatest power for change is real people sharing real stories. And I think within that is some optimism, because ultimately there are more of us than there are of them, just in broad speaking, for people that kind of respect the institutions of their country, although it's hard to see. And all we're really doing is doing a form of relational organizing, for those of you who have a background in politics, and doing it online, which is groups of like-minded people sharing authentically and openly with their networks. And every day that we do it, the networks gets bigger, right? The machines get smarter. we begin to be able to answer questions about what would restore faith in the United States government, what would restore faith in our institutions, and then to have enough people power generated to be able to do that. So all we did was create the flycatcher, so to speak. It's just an apparatus. It's two very simple mechanisms. And now it's just, can we continue to feed that funnel? And most importantly, where there'll be a will and an appetite from government and from, you know, institutional players that care about such things as the preservation of democracy to do this. And what's exciting, Brian, to your first point was brands are getting this. Brands are getting that the discourse is continuously shifting, that they're losing trust, right? That they need a different type of messenger and they need to move at the speed of the internet. So ultimately, whether you're trying to restore faith and health and democracy, or you are trying to sell automobiles, it becomes kind of the same process, same ethos, and same experience.
Wow. Well, hey, John, you want to go on for another hour? Because I have more questions.
Well, let's have Curtis back, you know, if he's willing.
Yeah, Curtis, we'd love to have you back. I mean, just phenomenal stuff. I have a whole bunch more questions that I want to ask, but you know, with that said, Curtis, thank you for the work you're doing, and I will see you on the back end in some of our other work together.
You got it. Thank you, John. Thank you, Brian. My pleasure.
Great to meet you.
Peace.
Whew. Well, another action-packed episode, John.
That was really interesting, and an interesting juxtaposition of the two, I have to say. You know,
Yeah.
So every show is like a collage of sorts, right? And sometimes the connections between the two stories are just incredible, food for thought.
Yeah, you know, one thing in closing, you know, Alex brought up the notion that Facebook didn't have an operating system except for, you know, in terms of virtual reality, it's Oculus work. But you know, in about 2007, 2008, I can't remember when, I wrote this article about what I was calling the human operating system and how things like Facebook with the social graph and Twitter with the interest graph at the time were essentially creating this operating system where we as human beings, the nature of our communications, the nature of our relationships and connections, were sort of operating on these platforms. And, you know, something struck me as I was listening to Curtis, which was, you know, they had this operating system, this human operating system. And I think where Facebook made the greatest mistake of its, I mean, look, I'll call it a mistake, but it's only turning greater and greater profits. So clearly it's working out for them, which was trust. Facebook violated trust, and it's done so on multiple occasions. And that's a flaw in an operating system. And it's actually proving to show a flaw in ourselves. And it's being exposed greatly. And I think the work that Curtis is doing is incredibly valuable on turning the mirror on ourselves and realizing that we have to exercise our voice or we lose.
And that trust is something that has to be earned continuously, you know, much as creativity has to be applied to business models continuously. And that abrogation of trust on the part of Facebook may be one of the reasons why it's not going to be around in 500 years, unlike maybe some of the other guys.
Right. Well, wow. With that said, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for participating from all around the world, for sharing where you are, listening in throughout an incredible conversation, for sharing your observations and your questions. We hope to see you every week, Thursdays at 10:30 Pacific. And also, please go to our backlog. It's getting updated, and you'll see a complete remodel of it soon at intersectionslive.com. So you could see some of our other guests. I don't think we've had a dull episode yet. And if anything, I actually do plan on going back and watching some of these things and turning these into articles. And John, I know that you feel the same way. So everyone, thank you so much. With that said, and we're going to turn it over to Gregarious to send us out with our outro.
Have a good week. Have a good week, folks.